First question I have is, what do you think are the most commonly misunderstood concepts on the topic of AI competition between big superpowers like the US and China?
I think the primary misunderstanding is the nature of the competition itself, right? In the United States, the government doesn't run or shape AI at all. It's being led by a series of fairly large corporations, private sector groups that are very focused on creating very large LLMs. That really is what they're about. In China, the research is much more, there are private companies doing LLM work, but the government is very active in AI research and funds quite a bit of it and is much more interested in what I would call a very holistic approach to artificial intelligence. They fund work on brain computer connectomics. They have a lot of efforts to do brain inspired AI designs and hardware designs. It's a much more holistic approach than in the US because it is driven by research investments from the government. So it's a very different competition, and to just focus on frontier models and increasingly large LLMs misses a whole part of the dynamic that's going on in China that is not. While there are parts and pieces of it in the U.S. and in other countries, it's just not being invested in as systematically as it is in China.
And just as a follow-up, I've noticed that China is way more focused on like open source models like DeepSeek, Qwen, etc., or Asia as a whole, and the West is more focused on like closed source. Do you think there might be like a deep reason for that, or just random?
I don't think it's random, but I don't also think it's like a very deep reason. I think it's representative both of the environment that Chinese private companies are, that are, again, most of the LLM work in China is from the Chinese private sector or semi private sector. And they are playing a very effective second follower, if you wish, model where they can pretty much keep pace and are they 6 months behind, 4 months behind, a year behind? They're not very far behind. And it'll be very interesting to see how they compete because on the market, they can deliver a product that's, say, I'm picking an arbitrary number, 80 or 85% as good as the closed source one, but at a tiny fraction of the cost. So it can become, as they compete for customers around the world, a very interesting dynamic there.
And as a general, when governments consider like deploying AI technologies and other new technologies, how do they distinguish between purely like hype and excitement with actual quality capabilities?
Yeah, well, I wish we could all treat governments as one single thing and give you an easy answer, but it depends a lot, right? And I'm most familiar with the US government, but I think it's true of most of the major nations. There are parts of governments that have a long history of doing tests and evaluation and assessments. For example, the US military, the intelligence communities, parts of the Department of Homeland Security, other parts not so. It's uneven, right? So how they adapt and test and distinguish hype from capabilities depends a lot. I mean, again, the ones who have established processes for testing systems and evaluating how they work have very complicated, sometimes very too complicated and long processes for technologies evolving very quickly, but they can continue to follow those. Others, right? For example, the in the United States, the health and housing and social security type departments, they could really use a lot of artificial intelligence to deliver services more efficiently, to allocate resources more efficiently, to weed out inefficiencies and make the process better. Those are organizations that tend not to have that kind of technical expertise. So, how they will adapt and distinguish between which providers are going to really deliver value and hype is, to me, where the real issue is.
And what do you think is the main bottleneck to implementation of this new AI, new technologies? Do you think it's strictly functional implementation, or more so like bureaucratic, as you mentioned, like it goes through 1,000 processes and then it's implemented?
I think the biggest challenge is a little bit of it's a little bit of all those, but it's I'll focus it in a different way than you're asking the question. Uh, the challenge is governments in general, at least in and especially the U.S. government, is really good at buying things, boxes, right? Be it a fighter airplane or a computer system that will process the taxes, right, and figure all that stuff out. They are not, they're used to literally buying those as things, right? IBM would come in, deliver the computers with the software as a thing that you just turned on and it worked. They are not very good at buying software, which is continuously being updated and how to handle the updates, right? They're not used to that. And AI falls much more into that other category of almost being a software service, right? It's a very different thing. And that's the real problem. The systems aren't made to buy those things. People don't know how to plan those as well. They're used to buying a box that lasts for 10 years, and then I buy a new box with new capabilities. And that is the fundamental challenge I think governments have, is they don't know how to buy software, the regulatory processes, the funding processes and mechanism of what the legislatures allocate money for is not well aligned with buying a continuous thing like software, which is evolving and you're continuously spending money on it to evolve it.
And
Is that helpful?
yeah, absolutely. And recently there has been a lot of talk about autonomous systems, especially with like Anthropic and the Department of War. And do you think when do you think is the approximate timeline we might be able to reach like fully autonomous systems, and how do you think that will change the future of warfare?
Well, we got to be careful what we mean by autonomous system because, surprise, surprise, autonomous lethal systems have existed and been used since the 1980s by many militaries. The Patriot air defense system, the Aegis air defense system, THAAD, all function under the appropriate circumstances when turned on that way in fully autonomous modes, which is both good and bad. We've seen that. Patriot, which tends to operate mostly in autonomous mode once it's turned on, uh, was responsible in 2003 for shooting down several friendly aircraft as opposed to enemy aircraft. At the same time, there was the famous incident with the Vincennes in the 80s where it shot down an Iranian Airbus. In the first case of Patriot, it was an autonomous system making a bad decision in identifying friendly aircraft as an adversary. But in the case of the Vincennes, the automated system had it right, and it was the humans who overrode it to shoot down what turned out to be an airliner. So based on that alone, what really matters is how well I think humans and autonomous systems work together. Do the humans understand the capabilities and limitations of the system? Do they understand when to allow an autonomous system to function autonomously, and how do they supervise it? And is the information presented by the autonomous system as it reports what it's doing in a way that's conducive for the human to understand it? Or is it reported in a way which makes it hard for the human to understand, leading the human to perhaps either override it when the human should not, or to fail to detect the autonomous system is not executing what was desired by the human, right? That interface, the man machine interface, and the teaming, which is literally do they work well as a team and understand each other, I think the most critical part in in the use of autonomous systems like this. I would point out that creating a team among humans is a very hard process. I mean, that's what militaries do painfully, tediously, but well, of casting first 12 individuals in a platoon or 20, however it may be, to work as a team so that they know, you know, what the soldier on your left and what the one on the right is going to do without having to ask them and pay attention, and trust that you're not going to get left behind and your colleagues know you're not going to leave them behind, that you're going to protect them. How do you get that way with an autonomous system? How does that work? It takes militaries a year or two of training to get humans to work that way. How are they going to work that way with an autonomous system? Whether it's a lethal autonomous system or an autonomous robotic dog that carries the backpack and the ammunition and all the supplies, right? if you have to be paying attention to it all the time and have it on a leash, it's no better than having a mule. You really need something that moves with you, understands what you're doing, and communicates. How do you get there is, I think, the really difficult question.
And just as a rough prediction, I know it's pretty difficult to predict the future, 5, 10 years in the future, but how do you think warfare will look like? Do you think it will get to a state where people won't be deployed anymore and it will be just simply like drones, autonomous, like those kind of autonomous systems, or do you think it will continue to be humans as well involved?
I think humans will continue to be involved. I don't see how that's avoided. I do think some of the things you've been seeing in Ukraine, and we're now seeing with drones in the current Middle East conflicts, will continue to expand. Um, but I don't see humans staying away from the decision process and being able to do it entirely remote, completely remotely from your living room, so to speak. You won't be able to zoom into a war. Uh, and I would point out that professional militaries of all nations are very conservative in the sense that you will not be comfortable delegating your authority to machines. You're often very uncomfortable delegating authority to your subordinates because of the culture of that institution. I think that will become very hard to overcome that sense of, at the end, I as an individual, as a commander, am held responsible. How do I oversee this and manage this? So I think it will be slow. What you will see is more effective use of cheap weapons like cheap drones being used increasingly effectively.
Absolutely. And on the topic of like autonomous systems, as you mentioned, it's some if you're not gonna if it will become difficult to oversee the process like of autonomy, then what's the point of having it autonomous? So on the topic of that, if they do become autonomous in the sense that uh, they won't need like heavy supervision, do you think there will be some sort of like cybersecurity threats and um, also like there's this idea of like AI doom that this AI will have its own intent as well and something like that, or do you think these autonomous systems will have a strong enough like secure system that we won't face these threats?
Uh, let's put AI doom sort of, it's almost its own separate discussion, but thinking of AI enabled weapons and AI driven weapons, I think the cyber, they're digital system like anything else. So they're going to be cyber attacked and will be vulnerable to cyber attack. Where does the AI make it easier to defend a system or does it make it AI easier to attack? I think is a very complex question. One of my colleagues, Drew Long, just published a paper in 2025 that specifically looks at uh, how AI will impact the offense defense balance in cyber. And it's not even. There's certain cases and situations where you would expect the offender, the attacker, the cyber attacker to have the advantage. And others, it may be the defender, which will have the advantage. And it's a complicated, subtle back and forth between the two. So I think in some cases you can argue that defense or offense will be easier with AI, but it's not an across the board that cyber across the board will be easier for the offender defender. And I recommend that paper to you. It's a nice way of looking at how it's subtle and it depends on sort of the exact context. Obviously, for things like if you want to steal money and do it at scale, AI is your best friend ever if you're a criminal wanting to do that, right? The amount of tailored uh, attacks you as individuals can get trying to scam your money, it's already snowballing. The data shows it's snowballing, and it's just going to get better and easier to fool individuals. So that's one thing. It lets you do that at scale, highly tailored. How it will play out in attacks on AI systems in combat can be hard. Depends too, right? A lot of military systems, the comms to them will be very highly encrypted. Encryption's still pretty good. We'll leave off quantum breakthroughs on encryption to the side and decryption. So that'll help in the sense that you'll have an assured channel. You know who you're talking to. But all, at the end of the day, they're digital systems. They may have weaknesses. And the weakness chain on AI systems is huge because it's not just the digital system live that's attackable. Did someone corrupt the training data to begin with and plan? Right? They're all that whole steps of creating AI, which we could talk about for a long time. But I've gone long enough on this question.
Absolutely, and I think another important and interesting question is the effect of AI on economics. And my question is, as technologies like AI become more central to national power, do you think metrics like GDP will become less relevant, and things like computer capacity, energy consumption, and the computer infrastructure and those kind of stuff will become more relevant, as especially like we're seeing the comparisons between the US and China, like electrical consumption and those kind of stuff?
I, I mean, I actually think uh, I do think those metrics matter, which they didn't matter before, but to me, those are micrometrics. I think your question, I would flip it around. If all these advantages in compute capacity, energy consumption, AI infrastructure and capabilities do not lead to an improvement in GDP, that's telling you they don't matter, right? If it does not transform our economies in a way that they are generally better, and GDP economy, I'm a mathematician, not an economist, right? But economists will say, oh, it's terrible, it's very macro. But the beauty of it is very macro, right? It's sort of an overall. If your GDP is getting better, it generally correlates highly with quality of life being better, right? We are producing more, the average individual is producing more. Therefore, if the economics are generally fair, I am making more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Your family has more disposable income. If all these investments in AI don't at the end lead to GDP improvements, it means it's not changing our lives and our society for the better. Why the hell are we spending all the money on it, right? I think it'll collapse of its own weight. That doesn't mean that these microeconomic things of compute capacity, and I would argue less energy consumption, more, I think, more important metric, energy production, uh, are the things that are important to track. They are important to track, but at the end of the day, GDP to me remains, as imperfect as it is, the best sort of general one number barometer of how your society is doing economically.
And as a follow-up, I don't know how strongly this is related, but you mentioned that energy is, of course, going to be one of the important factors. And my question is, like recently, Elon Musk mentioned that because of Bitcoin's dependency on like energy, that the fact you have to mine it and you need compute for it, there's a possibility that Bitcoin will become the groundwork for economy. Do you think that's a possibility, or do you think we're still far away from that?
I, I not only do I think we're far away from that, I think it's kind of ridiculous. I do. Uh, energy energy production capability matters. It does. We are continuously developing great new tools of all kinds, not just AI, that demand more power. Um, but to then tie and say, therefore, Bitcoin is the thing that matters is ridiculous. All kinds of things depend on power, not just Bitcoin. I think that's Elon perhaps trying to inflate his own investments in Bitcoin, not much more than that. But energy is, if you look at the trends in society from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to today, one way you can look at it, I've seen them, and I wish I had a citation to give you, but I don't remember, but these interesting graphics of power consumption by individual, the per capita, if you wish. And it's a steady trend upward. We are living a world which is much easier than that of our predecessors, but it's really thanks to being able to command and exploit and make productive use of more and more energy and having that at our disposal. So it's going to matter. However, I don't think energy is finite, right? We're figuring there's enough solar power landing on the planet Earth to power everything we do if we can figure out how to harness it, right? So there's a lot to go. Fusion offers tremendous potential, And I will point out that since I was in high school in the 1970s, it was always said that fusion reaction, controlled fusion reaction, power generation from fusion is 20 to 30 years away. And my entire life, it has been 20 to 30 years away. And I'm now in my mid 60s, and it's still, all the predictions are that in 20 or 30 years, we will have fusion power plants. And when that happens, the cost of energy, in principle, the availability of energy and the cost of generating it should really decrease. Environmental concerns should, in theory, decrease. Um, so that was my perspective on it. I think its importance is there. I think coupling it to the importance of making Bitcoin central is sort of silly.
Now on the topic of like think tanks and independent organizations, how important do you think think tanks and independent organizations are in shaping how governments understand, especially in the West? I mean, specifically in the West,
Yeah,
and for emerging technologies like AI, and how much do they influence actual policy decisions?
I think their biggest value, and I think it's significant, is actually as a training ground. It's not the research they do directly, but the number of young people who experience, develop professionally at think tanks, in academic research organizations that focus on policy issues. I don't mean pure academic research. And I think that's the biggest contribution they make, because these young people then go and serve in government, where they bring these skills, these ideas, this knowledge, this expertise, and don't just make recommendations. They're in the position to actually implement recommendations and to help their leaders implement recommendations smartly, right? To improve the acquisition of AI, to do AI, make sure they don't get, back to your earlier question, they don't fall for the hype, but actually understand where the AI is helping. Secondly, I do think the reports they produce and products they produce do help inform the debate. They do help ground things in objective research. And I think that's a reasonable, significant contribution and influence in government. It depends a little on administrations. Today in the US, we have an administration who's not very open to this kind of work or not as receptive of it. But the experts in government working the details generally still do rely on that work anyway, even if at the higher levels it isn't. But I really think, looking back on my career and the folks I've helped mentor and train, that it's the first. It's the people themselves working at this that train and develop professionally and grow, that then go into government. That's the biggest product and the biggest long-term influence.
And on the topic of like introducing new policy and stuff, how realistic do you think it is to establish meaningful international rules or agreements on AI development and deployment?
Oh, I would love to say, oh, it's great. It should be easy. Uh, I think it is, I won't say crazy, but I think it's pretty, very not realistic, if not unrealistic, to expect that. The only places where we have a history of reaching reasonable international structures for making these decisions have been in nuclear weapons and in chemical biological weapons, primarily in chemical, less than biological. And even those, these in the current era, are being unwound and dismantled. And a nuclear weapon is a pretty concrete thing that we agree on the definitions of it. It's fairly big. It's a thing that's sort of big and detectable and manageable. It's not like an AI software, which is intangible and I can transmit to you instantly, and so much of it is already open source. And we haven't been able to control nuclear weapons completely, and our existing international rules and agreements on that are unraveling. So I'm not very hopeful. I'm not saying it's not worth trying, but I think it's a long shot. I think it would almost take a miracle to make any of that work.
Absolutely. And lastly, for students, high school students like us interested in working on AI policy or national security, what kinds of backgrounds or skills would we maybe look for, attain, or any advice you'd have for us?
I think it is cool that you guys want to work on AI policy and in general more national security, tech informed national security. The world needs it. I think there are three things you should develop. Number one is some technical knowledge, some technical expertise. And I say some because you don't need to be a tech leader. You don't need to be the most brilliant engineer, software writer, developer ever. But you need enough to understand it, to keep up with what the technology is doing, to know when a technological CEO is giving you straight scoop or he's telling you bullshit, right? To do that kind of stuff. To be able to keep up with the literature, to be able to read a research article, and you don't have to follow every detail, but to sort of understand what it's saying and what's really novel and new here and what isn't. But then I would say, even more important than that, you got to have that basic technical knowledge are two things. One, the ability to communicate clearly. Uh, uh, what I call it at CSET, I have hammered into our folks the idea of plain English, replace English with Georgian, French, German, I don't know, whatever your language is, but being able to speak plainly. I've told our folks, you have to be able to explain what your research is, why it matters, and what it says to your grandparents, right? You have to be able to do that, and you have to be able to do it in 5 minutes. If not, you aren't explaining it simply and clearly enough. So that's the second, be able to do that. And you have to be able to do that in writing, and you have to be able to do that in presentations, formal presentations. You need to be able to do that in just conversation as you're walking down a hall. And then the third, which is also very important, is you need to understand how your government works. How does it make decisions? Who is responsible for what? There is nothing worse than getting a meeting with an important government official, conveying important recommendations to an official who has no authority or power to make those recommendations, right? So you have to know which each individual level, you have to understand government at a sufficient level to understand who the person you want to speak with is and exactly what authorities they have and what authorities they can't. Because maybe of your four recommendations, there are only two that that person has any authority or power over. So you want to focus on those two instead of the other two, right? So you need to understand that. And uh, the number of young people who have these great recommendations but don't understand how their own government works at sufficient detail to understand that none of these recommendations apply to this person you're going to talk to. It's a waste of their time and a waste of your time. You need to find the right person to talk to, and it's someone else. That's really important. Otherwise, you're going to get very frustrated. The people you talk to are going to be very frustrated. Like, why are you telling me this? I don't control any of this stuff, right? Uh, and it becomes a very, I find that it's a turnoff both for the government official, because they think you're an academic and pie in the sky, you don't understand anything, and for you, who've invested so much blood, sweat, and tears, have good recommendations, but you're just talking to the wrong person, right? So that's why I think understanding your own government and how the mechanics of it work is so critical.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. It was a wonderful conversation. It was absolutely incredibly interesting, and thanks for taking the time. And yeah,
No, my pleasure. Thank you. And again, support what you're doing. I hope you are successful in your
thank
careers.
you
And
very
if there's
much.
anything I can do to help advance or encourage you further, let me know.
Yep, absolutely.